watching Bounce TV News at 7.
This is Rahman Johnson. You're joining us for a special edition of Bounce News tonight. We're live in Sanford, Florida at the courthouse where just 48 hours ago the trial of George Zimmerman was held in the death of Trayvon Martin. He was found not guilty by a jury of 6 of his peers, and this is where the eyes of the community and indeed the world are right now. Again, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm Rahman Johnson, and the community of Sanford is coming together for a day of prayer, a day of reflection, and a day of just looking at what happened in the wake of this controversial verdict.
Everyone is watching the people of Sanford. And everyone is noticing that the people of Sanford come together.
Now, that Chief Smith, the chief of police, went on to say, because all eyes are on Sanford, that's all the more reason to remain peaceful and trust that things are happening for a reason.
We see the big picture that regardless of the outcome, regardless of the situation, we put it in God's hands. And if we don't put it in God's hands, what happens? Because everybody wants to see us go out and act up.
Now, the ceremony ended with words from Sanford's mayor echoing the calls for peace.
I'm going to end with this one phrase that I found the other day. It says from Matthew 5:9, "Blessed be the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." We're all children of God.
Now, there have been somber words and ceremonies happening all over the country, but again, peace is the name of the game. That's what people are asking for. Andrew Spencer joins us now for continuing coverage.
From New York to Seattle and Los Angeles to Sanford, Florida, protests all over the country followed this weekend's verdict. Some people wore hoodies, others held posters with Trayvon Martin's face, demanding justice and trying to honor the Florida teenager who was killed last year. Civil rights leader Reverend Jesse Jackson told CNN protests like this are inevitable.
They must be carried out with dignity and discipline, and let no act discredit the legacy of Trayvon Martin or the appeal of his family.
And most demonstrations were peaceful, like this one in San Francisco and others in Denver, Detroit, and Baltimore. But as the night went on, a handful of protests did turn sour. Police in Los Angeles declared a tactical alert. CNN affiliate KABC reported one group of protesters threw rocks at officers who responded by firing beanbag rounds. In Oakland, protesters angry with the American justice system standing below one American flag while burning another. The legal fight isn't over for George Zimmerman, who could possibly face federal civil rights charges and a civil lawsuit in Trayvon Martin's death.
I'm wearing my hoodie as a symbol to all of those who have supported us, the millions of followers that we've had who brought George Zimmerman to the arrest, who brought him to meet a jury of his peers, and we have faith that next time we will get a conviction.
That jury found Zimmerman not guilty, but still many protesters stood in the streets chanting, "No justice, no peace." I'm Andrew Spencer reporting.
Now, the outrage over the verdict is that some people say this anger, it's misplaced. And in interviews given after the verdict, defense attorney Mark O'Mara says all of the protests that are happening across the country are taking him by surprise.
I'm a bit surprised that there is outrage, because we had hoped that everybody would look at this case as being a very fair trial with both parties were represented well.
Skype is ringing. O'Mara continued to defend his client and says that the evidence supports them.
George had an absolute right to be where he was, and he also had a right to see where Trayvon Martin was. People want to say that it was improper profiling, but the reality is, with the circumstances that night and circumstances unrelated to Trayvon Martin, I think George had a reason to be concerned.
Now, O'Mara went on to say that regardless of how the conflict began, Florida law gave Zimmerman the right to defend himself. But it's being expressed at rallies isn't misplaced at all, and that for the family of Trayvon Martin, this verdict is indeed heartbreaking.
Right now, they are trying to make sense of this criminal verdict. As Sabrina Fulton said, we have to roll up our sleeves, because even though we've come a long way, we got a long way to go to make sure that this doesn't happen to anybody else's child.
Now, Trayvon's parents, Tracy Martin and Sabrina Fulton, have called for people via Twitter and other social media to remain calm and disagree peacefully. I follow Sabrina on her Facebook page, and she follows me. And one of the things she says that it's her faith that got her this far, and she's just asking for peace and to remain calm and remain in faith. Now, the Martin family, of course, was not present in the courtroom when the verdict was published. Now, joining me for some legal perspective and to take a look at things out on the West Coast is attorney and former prosecutor Brian Keith Williams. Keith, how are you?
I'm good. Good evening to you, Rahman.
Thanks so much for joining us. Good evening to you. We're here live in Sanford. And Keith, when this came out, I know some of the protests that got a little out of hand, as authorities were saying, were happening in Los Angeles. What do you know, before we get into the specific legalities of the case, what do you know that's going on as far as protests in Los Angeles?
Well, there have been protests since yesterday going on here in Los Angeles, both in the South LA area and in the Hollywood area of town, and in the mid-city area of town as well. People are understandably upset, and for the most part, these protests have been fairly peaceful. There was a little bit of a sour note last night. I think some outside groups probably joined in with those folks who were protesting, and things turned slightly violent, but for the most part today, the protests are peaceful, and folks are exercising their First Amendment rights.
And that's what I'm hearing from everyone I've talked to on the ground in LA and other places. They're saying that it's outside groups. It's not African Americans. It's actually other groups that are coming in, not the NAACP, that are causing these protests. Are you hearing that same thing?
I've heard the same thing, and in Los Angeles, we've had a history of that. I know I've prosecuted some groups in the past who have joined peaceful protests and sort of adopted that group that was doing the peaceful protest for their own personal prurient interests and made protests turn somewhat violent. I think that's perhaps what we're seeing here in Los Angeles again this round.
Well, Keith, let me jump right into the case here. One of the main questions that I'm asked over and over, and I know you know the law, so I want to ask you, Florida law allows for a jury to have 6 people as opposed to 12, which is the usual 12-man jury, if it's not a capital case. What is it that allows the jurist or the judge to say that it's okay to have a 6-person jury as opposed to a 12-person jury?
Well, oddly enough, it was in 1970 that a case came out of Florida that appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that the Sixth Amendment guarantees citizens a right to trial by an impartial jury of their peers, but it doesn't designate how many peers should be on a jury. In that case in 1970, there were 6 jurors on that particular case, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's fine, as long as it is a fair and an impartial jury and a jury of their peers. So a 6-person jury is fine. The law in Florida as it stands now is that you can have a 6-person jury unless it's a capital case, as you said before. And of course, a capital case is one that involves a death penalty. In this particular case, there is no chance of a death penalty conviction for Mr. Zimmerman.
Well, now, in the case, obviously, the jury has spoken and the decision is respected because of our legal system. But the main question is, if it were a jury of a larger jury, do you think the outcome may have been different?
I think that's highly speculative, and who really knows? When you look at the demographics of the town there, I believe it's more than 65-70% white and the rest others. If race was going to be a factor, I'm not completely sure that a larger jury panel would have really made a difference. I suspect that if it were 12 or 8 as opposed to 6, you might not have gotten a unanimous vote for not guilty. But I've said this all along. I don't think that the prosecution was going to be able to sustain a guilty verdict from the very beginning here. And so perhaps what might have happened here would have been a hung jury where you had 9-3 or 10-2, 10 on the side of not guilty. It was a very, very difficult case from the prosecution.
Let me ask you this. You said that the prosecution would probably have gotten not guilty, and that's, again, speculation that everybody is saying that, or the prosecution could have had a better chance. Did the prosecution overcharge this case?
I don't know if it's a question of overcharging the case or whether or not the case should have been brought in the first place based upon the evidence that they had at hand. Clearly there's a dead young man here, and something should have been done. I think ultimately the issue here is whether or not the law itself has to be changed and whether the prosecution of Mr. Zimmerman really had any chance of going forward in the first place. Again, I thought that it was a very difficult case for the prosecution. I don't want to provide an editorial on the performance of the prosecution, but I've seen better prosecutions occur before. They had some witnesses that were not the best witnesses, and the overall preparation of the case I don't think was as best as it could have been. Perhaps there was a resource issue. I don't know the individual circumstances there. But ultimately here, I think it calls for a change in the law. That stand your ground law was really the defining thing in this case. And then there also you may have to look at who exactly are the peers here. When you put together the jury, that's a big question there. And it's just almost the imperfect storm, if you would, on behalf of those who wanted to see justice carried out here. Everything that could have gone wrong probably did go wrong, and Mr. Zimmerman benefited from that.
Thank you so much. Again, Brian Keith Williams, attorney at law from the Los Angeles area. Brian, I'm sure this is not the last that we'll be talking to you about this case. Thanks so much. Now, we'll be right back. Protesters took their fight straight to the top today, calling on the Department of Justice to investigate George Zimmerman for civil rights violations. The George Zimmerman murder trial may be over, but it may not be the last time we see him in court. Tonight we're live here in Sanford, Florida at the courthouse where earlier, 48 hours ago, a decision of not guilty was issued in the George Zimmerman murder trial. Now, members of the National Black Church Initiative gathered Monday night outside of the Justice Department. Protesters want justice in the trial of Trayvon Martin against those murder charges of George Zimmerman in the death of Trayvon Martin.
The Black Church is asking and pleading and begging in Christ Jesus that the Justice Department, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, we're asking the White House, President Barack Obama, to file civil rights charges against George Zimmerman.
Now, the organizers made it clear that if the Justice Department doesn't act, that they will.
If the Justice Department concludes that he did not violate Trayvon Martin's civil rights, then we will, in a peaceful manner, go in prayer, and then after we come out of prayer, we're going to issue the word boycott Florida, boycott Florida, boycott Florida, boycott Florida.
Now, the protesters prompted the White House to weigh in on the issue as well. They called for calm and reflection in the wake of the verdict.
The president also wanted to ask every American to heed the call for calm reflection from Trayvon Martin's parents, a rather remarkable request given how much they have suffered and were suffering after losing their son.
In addition to calling for peace, the White House has also said that now is the time to look inward.
And he wanted to express his view that as we reflect in response to that call, that we should ask ourselves if we are doing all that we can to foster compassion and understanding in our communities and to stem the tide of gun violence, as well as how we can prevent future tragedies like this from happening.
Now, the president also personally weighed in, saying that we are a nation of laws and a jury has spoken. President Obama says he won't comment on the civil rights, nor will he get involved in the investigation. But the former Neighborhood Watch captain could find himself back in court. We'll be back with more live from Sanford, Florida in just a moment. Now, Saturday brought the end of the George Zimmerman murder trial with the verdict that came down. But as Shannon Travis explains, this may only be the beginning for Zimmerman.
Not guilty.
George Zimmerman is a free man, according to the state of Florida, but now the federal government is weighing possible action. Today in Washington, Attorney General Eric Holder addressed the case publicly for the first time since the verdict.
I share your concern.
On the issue of whether the Justice Department will file civil rights charges, Holder says the investigation is ongoing.
We are resolved, as you are, to combat violence involving or directed at young people, to prevent future tragedies, and to deal with the underlying attitudes, mistaken beliefs, and stereotypes that serve as the basis for these two common incidents.
Martin family attorney Ben Crump believes there's little doubt what Zimmerman did that night.
That's profiling, and there's a big question if that is allowed. And so I think the Justice Department should look at that.
But those who know Zimmerman say that's just not true.
This is so far from being racial, it's not even funny.
On Sunday, President Obama pleaded for calm reflection over the not guilty verdict. Protests have been mostly peaceful, if not impassioned.
No justice, no peace!
In Sanford, Florida, local pastors organized a noonday prayer to promote peace and unity in their community.
Blessed be the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God.
Now, the trial has gripped the nation and opened a lot of heated discussion. For some perspective, people are saying that this trial has been something that has completely moved the nation, from celebrities to international leaders, officials, and others. They're wondering what can they do and what's going on. And for that, let's take a look from our social critic, Misty Starts. Misty, are you with us?
Yes. Hi, Rahman.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us. You're live in Houston, Texas. And Misty, tonight, what are some of the things that you're seeing from the group? I know you are a social critic, and you've seen some of the reaction by celebrities. What do you think about what they're saying?
Well, this has definitely been a wake-up call for many people, including celebrities. And we're seeing as much outrage from them as we are from just your average American. And unfortunately, though, we have been seeing some folks, some high-name folks who are tweeting out George Zimmerman's address and his social security number. And in my personal opinion, that's not a good idea. You never want to repay violence with violence. So I'm hopeful, as many people are, that folks will not take that violent route. But they, celebrities, just as the rest of us, are very, very displeased with the verdict.
Are there ones? I know there's usually, we're always hearing from, I think Stacey Dash is one that kind of, you never know what she's going to say. Are there people, and I think I saw a tweet from Ted Nugent the other day. How are celebrities weighing in on the side of George Zimmerman?
Well, you know, it just seems that across the board, more people than not are sympathizing with Trayvon Martin's family. And I haven't seen, at least, not too many people who are sympathetic to George Zimmerman. However, some are saying that, you know, none of us, we weren't in the courtroom, we didn't hear everything that happened, and we don't know all about the law, so it's possible that the jurors did give the best verdict. So I'm hearing a little bit on both sides. However, it's overwhelmingly supportive of Trayvon Martin's family.
What about, I know one of the most interesting things I saw socially was people saying, and tell me what your thoughts are on this, they're saying that George Zimmerman now know what it means to be a black man in America. People are always going to be looking at him. He'll always have almost a target on his back. What are you hearing about those comments? And that's something that I've seen retweeted thousands of times.
You know, you're absolutely right. That's one of the top comments that people have been making across the board. And we're not talking just about African Americans. We're talking about everyone, no matter your race, no matter your class. And so a lot of people are saying how he has a target on his back now. They wonder, you know, will he ever have a normal life? Will his family ever have a normal life? And a lot of people are actually saying that that's the justice that, you know, that they can rely upon because he was acquitted of this crime.
I have to ask one final question. We only have a few seconds left, but I attended a rally the other night talking to some of the youth who organized a rally in Tallahassee, and the main thing that they did was got the message out within moments through Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and Pinterest and Tumblr and every other social media way they could. What do you think about that? They had hundreds out there to rally the night of the verdict.
I think it's amazing, and I think it shows that social media has really awakened the younger generation and given them power. It's put power in their hands, and now they're more likely to become more involved in issues not just of violence or things that are youth in nature, but they're more involved, period. So I think it's an amazing thing, and hopefully we'll continue to see that.
Misty, thanks so much. And you know, one of the things, I'll end with this, they said if only Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had Twitter back then, things might be different. Thanks so much for joining us, Misty. We'll be right back. Now, of course, the Zimmerman trial has Americans looking at self-defense and stand your ground laws, which is the law in Florida that George Zimmerman used to defend himself. For that, Brittany Jones has continuing coverage tonight.
It's It's a law in the books that's been questioned by many during protests and marches across the state. Does the stand your ground law protect or harm?
In the state of Florida, I think we're sending the wrong message that we are not even willing to have the debate on the stand your ground law.
Representative Alan Williams is pushing to make change. He sponsored a repeal of the law this past legislative session, but despite his efforts,
neither of the bills were heard in any chamber.
The 2005 law permits anyone who feels their safety or life is in danger to use deadly force without first exercising a duty to retreat. It's a law that many thought George Zimmerman was sure to claim after he shot and killed 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in Sanford, but his lawyers won the case by self-defense alone.
We cannot allow any more Trayvon Martins to die on our streets.
Ahmad Abuznade, legal policy director for the Dream Defender, agrees. He says the state's entire self-defense law needs to be reviewed.
We feel that there is self-defense for a reason, and that we don't need to give a wider gap of allowability for people to become vigilantes and seek justice on their own.
But the bill's sponsor, Representative Dennis Baxley, says that was never the intent and maintains it was put in place to protect Floridians.
People in that situation, being attacked by somebody, have moments to decide whether they want to live or they want to be a victim.
Baxley says he's open to conversation about changes to the law, but warns
I would be very cautious about doing anything that would diminish our citizens' right to protect themselves from harm.
It's a discussion supporters of the repeal hopes will happen soon.
We need the people on the other side to understand that lives are being lost, children are being lost, and we need to do something for our communities to make them safer.
Brittany Jones, Bounce TV 27.2.
Now, I'm looking at social media, and there again, it's trending. It says Trayvon Martin, as well as 106 for Trayvon, which is an homage to 106 in Park. And some of the tweets that we're getting and some of these messages is Trayvon Martin Justice at Bree says, I feel like America is too afraid to talk about race. They don't want to say it anymore. They make me feel uncomfortable. The National Action Network, which is Al Sharpton's group, is saying we have to discuss these issues and we have to discuss them now. And also Michaelangela Davis, who is a social critic, critical to hear the voices of black youth during this anxiety-ridden time. And that's some of the things we're hearing right here is anxiety right here in Sanford. Keep those messages coming. Twitter, Facebook, we want to know exactly what you're saying. Again, we'll have continuing coverage tomorrow from the NAACP conference nationally. But until then, I'm Rahman Johnson, and that's the last word from here in Sanford. Have a wonderful evening.